talked about major and perfect intervals. Now we're going to talk about minor, diminished, and augmented intervals. So it's important that you remember the specific number of half steps that we talked about for major and perfect intervals in our last video. We're going to work with, first, an interval of a major third. So if you remember, the interval of a major third consists of 4 half steps between one note to the next. So between C and E we have our 4 half steps. Alright, now in order to make an interval minor, if you have a major interval, you have to subtract 1 half step from that. So we need to make this 3 half steps. There are 2 ways you can do that. You can either lower the top note, which will shrink it that way, or you can raise the bottom note, which will shrink it that way. Either of those will take away 1 half step from your interval and make it minor. So if you're going to lower the top note, you would put a flat next to E, lowering. And if you wanted to do it the other way, raise the bottom note, you would add a sharp to C. And now we have the interval of a minor third. Let's try another example. Alright, now let's say we want to take the same interval and make it diminished. In order to take a major interval and make it diminished, you have to subtract a whole step, or in other words, 2 half steps from that interval. So we know right now that our major third has 4 half steps. So in order to make it diminished, somehow we have to make that now 2 half steps. Now, just so you know, we're not going to change where the notes are on the staff. They're still going to stay on C and E. We're just adding accidentals that will help take away 2 extra half steps or a whole step. Alright, so remember, to make it minor, you can lower the top note, and so that takes away 1 half step. You could also make that a double flat, and that would take away your 2nd half step. Now making it diminished. So the difference between these 2 notes, the interval, is 2 half steps, and that's going to make it a diminished third. So you can write that a diminished third that way, or a 3 with a degree sign, like that. Alrighty, let's go back to our major interval again. Now, we're still looking at diminished intervals. Another way that we can take this major third and make it diminished is by raising the raising the bottom note by a whole step or 2 half steps as well. So you can either lower the top or raise the bottom. Both of those will shrink your interval. So if we're going to make this diminished by raising the bottom note, we'll use a double sharp sign, since double sharp means to raise a note by a whole step. We have now taken away 2 half steps. We're left with 2 half steps, and we have a diminished third. Lastly, we can also make an interval augmented. So augmented means you're going to stretch it out just a little bit, specifically by a half step if you're starting with a major interval. So we're starting again with our major interval of a third that has 4 half steps from one note to the next. And in order to augment this, we have to add an extra half step in there. So we can either raise the top note with a sharp sign, so C to E sharp will raise that interval, or we can lower the bottom note, and that will extend our interval by a half step as well. Alrighty, so just to recap the principles here, when you have an interval and you want to make it larger, you can either raise the top note or you can lower the bottom note. Both of those will make your interval larger. If you want to make it smaller, you can lower the top note or you can raise the bottom note. Both of those will shrink the space from one note to the next. Alright, perfect intervals can only be perfect, augmented, or diminished. So let's use an example of a perfect fifth. From C to G. Alright, this is an example of a perfect fifth. If we wanted to make this interval diminished, we'll have to take away a half step. So we can do that by lowering the top note or by raising the bottom note. Again, either of those will work. Let's say we want to raise the bottom note. Now, in order to make a perfect interval diminished, it's only changing by one half step. So you don't have to worry about the double sharps or the double flats here. All right, so we've got our perfect interval, we've raised the bottom note. Now we have a diminished fifth. You could also do the same by adding a flat sign up here. We have made our interval smaller. It's a diminished fifth. All right, you can also augment your perfect intervals, meaning that you're going to make them larger by a half step. And you can do that by raising the top note or by lowering the bottom note. Now don't do both. You don't want to raise the top note and lower the bottom note, because then you're taking your interval and actually stretching it out by a whole step. You just want to move one of them. All right, so you can either raise the top